It is now my pleasure to announce the Fireside chat that is going to be moderated by Ms. Elaine White Gomez, former Vice Minister and Ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Nations and Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. And Mr. Pierre Krähenbühl, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who are going to discuss ICRC's work and what being on the front line and maybe taking up Rabia's image, being on the gates of the road that leads to hell, truly means. Excellency, Director General, I'm delighted to give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I really want to express my appreciation for your being here, for accepting our invitation to have this conversation, Mr. Director General. I will call you Pierre from now on. We heard from our the opening speeches from both Rabi and Maria Fernanda, my friends and colleagues. Concepts that are fundamental. The first one is that negotiation is not diplomacy only. Negotiation doesn't happen only in diplomatic rooms. Negotiation is a survival tool and a survival strategy for human beings, but also for humanity, because now we are negotiating for global problems, for global problem solving, and we are in 2025 in a year that is so symbolic because it is also a year of transformation. And at the same time, we are witnessing an increase in the patterns of conflict throughout the world. And perhaps, so you will tell us a little bit more about how the patterns of conflict are changing or remaining the same. But it is very difficult to reflect about negotiation, how to increase the capacity of the international system of countries and of communities to negotiate if we don't understand the different nuances, the different styles, and the different realities of negotiation. As Ambassador Espinosa was saying, we don't negotiate only in diplomatic rooms. The work of the International Committee of the Red Cross brings us to a completely different perspective of this conversation, because you need to negotiate on the ground in the front lines to provide access, to gain access to victims, to agree on the operational dimension of rescuing hostages, and many other aspects that we maybe don't know about. So the first question that I would like to pose to you is, please help us understand what it means to negotiate for humanitarian work in the front lines, in the line of fire many times. And when the consequence of failure is not that we don't talk to each other anymore. The consequence of failure is the difference between life and death.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you for the opportunity to join you at this important event. We really appreciate. I think you've highlighted and put in context something that is very important in our work. And just before addressing the specific point that you're making about the work of the ICRC, let me just connect with some of the comments that were made in the introductory remarks, because I think we are indeed living very dangerous times. It's a time where we feel that, and I'm sorry to just put it in these very simplistic terms, where the handbrakes have been released and where what was considered to be supposed to be under the UN Charter the last resort, which is to go to war, is becoming again a tolerated norm and first resort in today's world. And that always leads me to consider that as human beings we treat wars far too casually. Because in all of our years of study, but also in our work and what we watch on television, we've actually been led to spend more time memorizing the dates of great battles and the names of powerful generals than we have of the consequences, not just immediate, but long-lasting consequences of the armed conflicts that we... The ICRC still today receives requests in our headquarters from families who don't know anything about what happened to their loved ones in World Wars I and II. So, if you think that it is quickly a chapter one can turn, think again. That's why when we go and see the narratives that we are hearing today, how simplistically and easily politicians who yesterday spoke of the importance of values and peace and today re-embrace the narratives of justifications to war, what we are seeing is in fact something that is so deeply and simply human. It's a trilogy that is visible every single time we go into these dynamics, and frankly speaking, on every continent. The first part of that trilogy is the glorification of war. We develop narratives to explain why it will be just to send another generation of young people to sacrifice their lives on the front lines. And human beings are very good at creating narratives that glorify war. We all have them all around us in every society. The second phase, and that is the moment that we step into hell, is the dehumanization of the other. Because in order to justify the worst crimes against the other community, the other country, the other society, the neighbor, we have to first dehumanize him or her. To reduce the person to a non-entity, to somebody unworthy of existence, and then we feel free to commit the worst crimes. And once we have emerged from the abyss, we predictably once more say and promise to each other never again. Why is it that after having learned so often and read so frequently about the promise to not do it again, we are sliding into it once more? We have all read about how our societies, or many societies, somehow stumbled into World War I. And if we would read yet another book about it, we would say, it's amazing how they weren't able to prevent it. Are we wiser today to prevent the sliding into the next calamity? I can't see many signs of them, and it's time for us to collectively wake up in that regard. Now, as you kindly said, Elaine, our teams, every single day, are negotiating on the front lines of some of the most difficult contexts. And if I just describe what our colleagues have done over the last 2 years in negotiating with Israelis, with Hamas, about trying to access prisoners, trying to access hostages, preserving dignity and humanity on the battlefield. And it was probably one of the most dangerous environments that we have operated in decades, frankly speaking. Every single conflict is dangerous, but our colleagues who managed the field hospital in the south of the Gaza Strip were operating on injured people as bullets were flying through the tents, shrapnel was, because they were literally in the midst of it. Now, here I can give a concrete illustration. Thanks to the negotiations that were led by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, we were able to play this crucial role in the first phase now of the ceasefire to contribute to the release of those hostages that were still alive, to those prisoners, to many thousands of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, but also to hand over the mortal remains of the deceased that were both in Gaza and, of course, held by Israel. How do you achieve that? Because that is not a role that you can invent overnight. The fact that our teams on the ground were able to play that role is because for decades now we have been in communications with Israel and with Hamas, and actually some of our colleagues who are here with me were negotiating some of these agreements. And it is only by sustaining these communications over a long period of time that you're able to translate it. It comes back to something that was said, it's the necessity to build trust. Now sometimes we are accused, why do you have the contacts with this side? Why are you sitting down with these people? Well, that is exactly who we are. We sit down with everyone. All of us have in our careers negotiated from the most technologically advanced armed forces on the planet to the least structured non-state armed groups on this planet as well. That is the added value that we represent.
Thank you very much for giving us this reality check of what is going on in the world today and how we need to incorporate the human perspective into the conversation about geopolitics and about war and conflict and also on peace. I want to deep dive a little bit more into this negotiation for humanitarian purposes and how it is a little bit perhaps different from diplomatic negotiations that happen elsewhere. From my experience in diplomacy, I always bring to my students one advice. And I always tell them to avoid making decisions when they are in the heat of the moment. Why? Because then we are confronted with our own limitations of knowledge and judgment, so that we always have to look for a space to hear other perspectives, to read what we were presented with as a proposal, so that we can give a reaction to the proposals that is going to be good for all parties. But that is not a luxury that you have in the front lines. What can you tell us a little bit more about this negotiation, where obviously you build trust and credibility? Without that negotiation is not possible. You have to negotiate keeping in mind, I guess, that you have to consider the short, the mid, and the long perspective of always keeping the credibility of who you are.
Yes, that's an important point to describe, and maybe to put it into context. Sometimes we associate humanitarian work with a convoy that crosses a given conflict zone to distribute food assistance or medical assistance, and it is also that. But the task the ICRC was given by states through the Geneva Conventions of 1949 is also to focus on issues like visiting prisoners, so prisoners of war, or security detainees, or civilian internees, to search for missing persons, for example. And this is an activity that becomes very sensitive because, of course, detention questions, for example, are very, very closely related to national security imperatives. So I have never met an authority anywhere on the planet that spontaneously welcomes you into their prison system. So it requires hard and long negotiations. And of course, one principle that we put forward to create the trust is the ICRC's neutrality. Again, this is something worth explaining briefly, because when I was at university, I didn't find neutrality a particularly attractive principle, because I thought we are here to engage. We want our ideas to be communicated. We want to take a stand. The ICRC's neutrality can sometimes be misunderstood as a sort of form of indifference where you take a step back. And in fact, it's exactly the contrary. It's what allows us to take a step forward in these highly polarized environments. If we were choosing a side, we would never be given the access to these very sensitive places of detention. And so the negotiations, as you rightly say, require that you build trust over many months, sometimes years. You can lose that trust in an afternoon by making a wrong statement, by offending the wrong person. Maria Fernanda Espinosa was mentioning earlier the importance of listening. But I find that the combination between listening and not judging the other is very important. And I will tell you why, because in fact, the other part that I think we have to be very honest about when we think of the descriptions that were given earlier about hell and the conflict environments is we are, each and every one of us, as human beings, capable of creating hell for the other under the wrong circumstances. And there are societies in which we believe that because we've reached a certain advanced state of politics or democracies or whatever it is, that means we will not misbehave on the battlefield. That is a mistake. Every single society has to be careful to put the brakes on a natural human tendency. You know, the negotiators of the Geneva Conventions in 1949 understood perfectly the horrors that human beings are capable to inflict on other human beings. And we all have, each of us is capable of that under the wrong circumstances. And so we should not judge the prison director somewhere on the world who might be torturing detainees. We should ask, and that is a question that has accompanied me a great deal in over these years, if this conflict were happening in my country, who would I have been? And I cannot answer that question with certainty. I would like to think that I would be the human rights defender, that I would be the critical journalist denouncing the violations, but I cannot say that for certain. It is easy to be recruited into an armed group and to commit the irreparable. So we must also constantly think, how do I influence the other side? Because my objective is to get into that prison. My colleagues who are working in so many conflicts around the world need to have that open listening and that capacity to shape an environment that becomes conducive to respect for humanitarian workers.
Thank you for sharing that very, not only reflective, but very human perspective of who we can be. And this brings me to a very important question for the conversation today is, when we are talking about prevention and preventive diplomacy in diplomatic spaces, from the perspective of the experience of ICRC, what does prevention look like and how we need to approach that agenda to balance prevention and conflict management as the drafters of both the UN Charter and the Geneva Convention did? Because they were the first experts. Of course, we have very important experts here. But the original experts were the drafters of the Charter and the drafters of the Geneva Convention, because they came out of the experience of hell.
So, to illustrate your point, we are currently dealing with 130 armed conflicts on the planet. So that's far more than what we normally perceive, considering the over-attention that we have, justified attention on Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and that deserve all the attention that they get, but there are 130 conflicts currently. And so we have on the one hand a proliferation of conflict. On the other hand, we have the big challenge, which is the average long duration of these conflicts. The ICRC has now been present for 75 years in Israel and in Palestine, for 50 years in Colombia, for 40 years in Afghanistan, for 35, 40 years in Yemen, in DRC and others. That was not the original idea for humanitarian organizations, to be present for so long in these. It tells us something about the current weakness when it comes to preventing wars and to resolving wars. Sometimes when I follow the debates at the UN Security Council, there's more time spent discussing humanitarian corridors than actually bringing about some of the solutions. We need a paradigm shift here. We need a re-legitimization of negotiation, of mediation. Frankly, we need more political courage also, because what I'm hearing these days is a lot of politicians saying, we will never again talk to the other side. That's not an act of courage. When things get difficult is when you need more dialogue, not less. When you need to preserve channels, not close them. And this is something in today's world where I see narratives retreating behind the courage of not talking, which again isn't an act of courage. So we need to reconnect and to value. You know, there are also narratives that seem seek to delegitimize what was achieved under the UN Charter or the Geneva Conventions, calling them frameworks no longer adapted to today's challenges, as if the negotiators in 49 or in 45 had not seen all of the horrors that we're able to achieve and to inflict on others. They knew exactly why. They did not come from the point of view that human beings are in general good, and therefore we just need a few frameworks to manage the moments of crisis. No, they had understood that we are capable of the worst, and therefore need frameworks like the Charter, rules like the Geneva Conventions. And these days we are seeing double standards in the application of the Geneva Conventions very clearly. So the same politicians who will address critical remarks on one conflict will not use those references on another conflict. That undermines the legitimacy and the strength of these frameworks. Another tendency that I see a great deal and that doesn't help in prevention is, you see it probably for human rights, but let me just focus on international humanitarian law that applies in armed conflicts. We see a lot of circumstances today where leaders will criticize one side in the conflict for not respecting or not honoring their obligations under international humanitarian law. The paradox is that they spend more time criticizing the side over which they have the least influence. What would be more useful is to pick up the phone and call one's friends and say to one's friends, I am your friend, and this is why I'm telling you this behavior of yours is undermining my own credibility of being your friend. What we most see is narratives that justify, excuse the violations committed by one's friends, and then again addresses criticism over a side over which one has no influence. That is not using preventive diplomacy and negotiations in a smart way. And here we need to bring about a change, because we know that we live in an interconnected world. We know that security challenges, be they in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, are interconnected, that they have repercussions across, and that a compromise on a fundamental standard in one conflict is going to be observed elsewhere. We already have armed groups that tell us in different parts of the world, why are you coming to us to speak about your international humanitarian law? Why don't you go and talk to some of the states that evidently don't fulfill their own obligations in some critical environments? This is a problem and a challenge for all of us, and I think we have to tackle it far more seriously than we currently are.
Thank you very much. I think that we could be here the whole afternoon talking with you and listening from your perspective and the perspective of ICRC. Actually, at this very moment, the member states of the United Nations are immersed in the 2025 review of the UN Peace Building Architecture, and this is happening already in the context of a sovereign reality that has emerged, which is the substantial budgetary reductions across the United Nations and across different functions. How could political and multilateral actors better incorporate the realities that you're talking about, that the ICRC sees on the ground, protection failures, perhaps a shrinking of the humanitarian space, these double standards in the application of the normative framework, or this normative decay of that we are seeing, this tendency to being more relaxed about complying with the obligations that were built for the international community. So when it comes to linking frontline realities with decisions taken in capitals and multilateral forums, are there specific recommendations, the final recommendations that you would have for diplomats about the kind of leadership that is needed to transform this current dialogue? And do you have any recommendations for all of us here? Many of us consider ourselves as very experienced or expert negotiators, but we have a lot to learn from the experience on the ground, in the different levels in which you engage. Because you talk with the political level, and also you are there on the in the front lines, on the ground, talking to different levels and a great diversity of actors with different views and needs.
Thank you very much. First, I think it's always very important to remain very humble about the recommendations, because I think working in the United Nations, for example, if I think of who sits in the Secretariat thinking about peace and security, or states, member states, politicians, those are far more complex mandates than ours. The humanitarian mandate is a difficult one to implement. It's very high risk on the ground, but it is very specific and doesn't have multidimensional aspects like, I think, the United Nations. But what I do think is that in today's world, if we look at, just take the example of the last 2 years of the absolute horror that we have gone through in the Gaza Strip. And when you work in the ICRC, you sit both with families of hostages and, of course, with Palestinians. So we understand the suffering, the anxiety that has run through all the communities that are concerned by this conflict. But if you imagine what has happened in Gaza, and if occasionally in meetings I'm asked, could the ICRC submit a further report about the circumstances? My question is, will you act on a further report? Do you need any other information about what has happened in Gaza? Do we really need to bring more elements before decisive political action is taken? Because we will all be haunted for decades by what has happened in the Gaza Strip. Each and every person has an individual level of responsibility for what has happened. We will be judged by generations to come about what did we say, not say, what did we do and not do. And it's inconceivable for me to think that all of this could happen under our collective watch, with our knowledge and with the developments. So I think it is about believing in the fundamentals that the UN Charter has laid down to re-legitimize the fact of negotiating with all parties, but also to believing in the respective humanity. The dehumanizing narratives that we currently see and witness are a great threat to all of us. And if we allow us to slide into a phase where we just simply consider war to be an inevitable component of human existence, when you consider something inevitable, you fail to respond to it properly. Think of what we did collectively during the COVID period. Now, we might not have all agreed whether the vaccination was the right path or not, and which vaccine, etc. But there was a collective mobilization. When conflicts happen, what I hear a lot is, well, it's just an inevitable part of being a human being. Well, I refuse that very fundamentally. Because if it is true that in each of us is the capacity to inflict horror on others, that is exactly why we have to mobilize. That is why between 1945 and 1951, we had the most creative phase in human history. The UN Charter was negotiated, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, and the Refugee Convention. And today we have people in academic circles and in political circles who allow themselves to undermine and delegitimize these frameworks. It's shocking. And I can tell you, if we plunge again into the abyss, we will be wiser when we emerge from it. Can we once be wiser before we plunge into the abyss? This is what I would hope for. But for that, we need a serious wake-up call.
Thank you very much. I think you have provided us with this wake-up call. I want to really thank you for taking your time to be with us and to share this reality and this very human and inspirational words. Also to know that each one of us has a responsibility of not allowing the language and the narrative of dehumanization, not zero tolerance towards the language and the first steps of dehumanization that we can very easily see in certain narratives throughout the world. So thank you very much, and please allow me to thank Pierre, not only for being here, but for the work that ICRC does throughout the world.
Thank you very much, Excellency, and thank you very much, Director General, for this fireside chat and for sharing your experiences, highlighting the importance of a human perspective and underscoring that we always need to remain in communication even if we have great differences with the other side.